In the month preceding his death in November of 1995, Deleuze was working on a book titled Ensembles and Multiplicities, which was going to be about one of the most important themes in all of his writings, namely the relation between the virtual and the actual. But when he realized that he could not complete the book in time due to health issues, he decided to publish a short text that would summarize his main insights. The text was published in September of 1995 and was titled Immanence, a Life. Why is the relation between the actual and the virtual so important? You may remember the key difference between the classical framework that opposes the possible and the real, and Deleuze's framework, which opposes the actual and the virtual. In the classical framework, being can have more or less reality. It can be represented as a vertical axis where different modalities, called the modalities of being, represent the different degrees of being. On the bottom, there is the modality called the impossible, which comprises objects and ideas that cannot exist, for example, a square circle. On top, we found the opposite modality, which describes the maximum of being and which is called necessity. It designates objects that must exist, such as numbers, principles, or for many thinkers, God. In between, we find all the possible shades of being, including possibility, which designates things that could exist under certain conditions, but do not currently exist. Things like unicorns, for example. We also find actuality, which is a little bit more real than possibles because it designates things that exist here and now. Some thinkers argue for contingency, which designates things that could exist without changing a state of affairs. For example, today could be rainy or not rainy, but it wouldn't change the fact that it's today. The point of this hierarchy of being is that it divides being into what is real, even super real, and what is not real, even impossible. And therefore it defines being according to transcendent coordinates. Deleuze opposes this view on the grounds that all of being has some kind of reality, including impossible objects and paradoxes, if only because they make us think. Instead of the possible and the real, Deleuze opposes the actual and the virtual, and he explains that actualization is the process by which a virtual becomes actual through differentiation, while the opposite process is effectuated through conjunction. For example, I can actualize a virtual memory in order to recognize something, which actualizes an image, or I can make actual and virtual indistinguishable, for example, when I hallucinate. To use Nietzschean language, you could say that the actual refers to the Apollonian form, which is limited and actual, while the virtual refers to the Dionysian, the unlimited, the drunkenness conveyed in an experience that is immediate and virtual. Because of these complex dynamics, the opposition between the virtual and the actual is much richer than that between the possible and the real, but it is also much more complex. Here, being is not transcendent anymore, but it is immanent, meaning that every particular change within being affects being as a whole. The axis of being becomes horizontal. It does not represent a hierarchy anymore, but the succession of actuality and virtuality, which constitutes real experience. Genesis, rather than mere possibility. It's not that transcendence does not exist in Deleuze's framework. In fact, he's quite formal that it's very real, but it has a special relation with immanence. As he says, transcendence is always a product of immanence. This relation of production can only be grasped in the opposition between actual and virtual. This is perhaps why it matters so much for Deleuze. Being, defined as immanent, becomes a subject of a permanent change, an open totality, as Bergson says, which breathes and pulses like a living entity, one which exists primarily in time rather than space, and in which transcendence occurs as a special case. Immanence Alive is a very short text, and we will see how it's structured in a minute. But it's important for a few reasons. On the one hand, it allows Deleuze to address this thorny question of the relation between immanence and transcendence, the ever-changing and the fixated, a relation which is filled with paradoxes and aporias. On the other hand, it gives us the very concentrated summary of what he wanted to say in Ensembles and Multiplicities. And finally, on the third hand, it stands as Deleuze's philosophical testament, his ultimate metaphysical vision, and it is an occasion for him to indicate which, among the many concepts and methods he created in the 40+ years of his writing career, should be used to answer this question. So in this video we're going to try and reconstruct this ultimate metaphysical vision, and while we're going to study Immanence Alive, we're also going to refer to the notes that were published in the 1996 reedition of the Dialogues. These notes are presented as a text, and they provide what seems to be the plan for Ensemble and Multiplicities. Taken together, these two texts give us a good if quite general indication as to where Deleuze wanted to go and what he wanted us to see. Immanence Alive addresses the paradox of immanence, which we could describe as follows. In technical terms, immanence means that the cause remains within itself to produce its effect. So for example, Spinoza's definition of God, who causes but also contains the world, and therefore changes as he produces the effect. By contrast, a transcendent cause means that the effect is external to its cause and is not changed by it. Such is the definition of efficient causality in general, for example. The problem is that our mode of representation, grounded in the concept, is fundamentally transcendent, in the sense that when we use language to produce meaning, we expect our words to have an effect that is beyond them or outside of them, which is why it's possible to say the same thing in different ways or in different languages. Deleuze says, immanence is not related to something as a unity superior to all things or to a subject as an act that brings about a synthesis of things. So how can we conceptualize immanence? How can we represent pure change, pure virtuality in actual representation? Imagine, for instance, that you're trying to describe a simple movement. What you would do, probably, is to describe its starting point and its end point, and then any point in between if needed. And you would assume that your audience would be able to reconstruct the passage between each of these points. These points can be immensely distant, or very close to each other, as in cinema, for example, but the process remains the same. Well, as far as the virtual is concerned, the solution is exactly this, and Deleuze defines several levels of virtuality. The first one is the transcendental field. If actual experience is defined by finite, subjective, reflexive consciousness, then it must be grounded in something that makes these things possible in the first place. And this is why he defines the transcendental field as a pure stream of asubjective consciousness, a pre-reflexive impersonal consciousness, a qualitative duration of consciousness without a self. This stream is what makes the particular reflexive moments emerge. Our finite conscious experience is grounded in this infinite consciousness. But of course, the reality of the stream itself does not consist in the representations that I have of it, but it's in the in-between the points that I put on it, in the same way that the reality of movement in cinema is the in-between of two photograms. This means that the transcendental field must itself be grounded. As Deleuze says, no more than the transcendental field is defined by consciousness can the plane of immanence be defined by a subject or an object that is able to contain it. This is to say that immanence, pure movement, is a presentation that must be represented, and it's not one that can be represented through points, since the points only give us an indirect representation of movement. Confronted with this paradox, Deleuze does what all philosophers do in such situation, which is to develop a method. The method to be used here is the famous method called transcendental empiricism, which he had first developed in Difference and Repetition many years prior. Transcendental empiricism is meant to help us approach the spaces between representations. As he goes on to explain, transcendental empiricism is not a usual quantifying method that tackles representations. It is rather, however close two sensations may be, the passage from one to the other as becoming, as increase or decrease in power, virtual quantity. In this sense, transcendental empiricism is a feel method. It's a method that allows us to determine if a passage is joyful or sad. It's a method of evaluation. It allows us to apprehend not extensive or physical quantities, as would be the case in a normal empirical method, but rather virtual quantities, something that is lived, the moment of immediate experience which expresses a pure change. If transcendental empiricism is the method to apprehend immanence, in the sense that it grounds empirical experience, or the transcendental field that makes empirical experience possible in the plane of immanence, then what is it that grounds the plane of immanence itself? What does transcendental empiricism really reveal? Here, Deleuze defines a third level of immanence, the deepest one. He says, "We will say of pure immanence that it is a life and nothing else. It is not immanence to life, but the immanent that is in nothing is itself a life. A life is the immanence of immanence, absolute immanence. It is complete power, complete bliss. It is an absolute immediate consciousness whose very activity no longer refers to a being, but is ceaselessly posed in a life." A life means that what we discover as the ultimate level of immanence is not so much a concept or a great unity, but rather a way of life. The immanent way of life is not a life that revolves around a self, my success, my failures, my memes, but rather it's an activity without a self. What a curious thing to say, and yet it's something that Deleuze quite often says in his texts. It seems that he is mentioning something like forgetting that we exist in space and time. What Deleuze is referring to here is something that is almost like a child's play, where we become a manifestation of time itself. After all, Heraclitus had already made the connection between childhood and temporality. But here is a question. Is this way of life about living the moment? Well, not exactly. In fact, Deleuze seems to anticipate Facebook wisdom by saying that it's just the opposite. It's about the in-between of moments. And he offers us a quasi-mystical vision. This indefinite life does not itself have moments, close as they may be to one another, but only between times, between moments. It doesn't just come about or come after, but offers the immensity of an empty time, where one sees the event yet to come and already happened, in the absolute of an immediate consciousness. Deleuze concludes Immanence a life with an ethical consideration, which is very close to that of the Stoics, actually very close to the one we have seen in Logic of Sense. Mentioning Joe Bousquet's famous quote, "My wound existed before me," Deleuze does not suggest that we should be tough and endure, but in a certain sense he suggests that we should do the opposite. We should let the events pass through us and apply no resistance to them. Do not let them bother us. My wound existed before me, not a transcendence of the world as higher actuality, but its immanence as a virtuality always within a milieu, plane or field. This is what transcendental empiricism leads us to, a kind of transparency with regards to the world. This text has a very strong poetic value, but I think it also points at very technical metaphysical aspects. The text certainly is a stylistic feat on Deleuze's part, to be able to make such profound and difficult points in such a concise manner, but it can also make them easy to miss. So here are a few points that I think are worth noting. First, the three levels of virtuality define each other, with the most fundamental one being a life. As Deleuze says, the transcendental field is defined by a plane of immanence and a plane of immanence by a life. The transcendental field is essentially the plane of immanence without the absolute consciousness. And so the plane of immanence is not the unconscious, but rather the space where all changes and affections, joyful or sad, occur. A life, meanwhile, is the locus where joy and sadness find their common denominator, which is to say that it's a space of pure becoming. Desire, change, must be anchored in a practice, a practical life. This practice will consist in making finite and actual something that is infinite and virtual. But what is it that effectuates this passage from the unlimited to the limited, or from the transcendental field to actual experience? What is it that produces my consciousness as a self? Or if you remember our previous analogy, what are the points that occur on the line and that limit it? Here Deleuze mobilizes a logic of fluxes, one which is present in most of his texts, most notably perhaps the Anti-Oedipus, where it's literally in the first sentences. The logic of fluxes is the logic by which an infinite consciousness becomes finite, that is, by which a subject is formed, and the limit at play here is sensation. He says, sensation is only a break within the flow of absolute consciousness, which indicates that the transcendental field is the field where virtuals become actual through sensation by limiting the infinite flow of consciousness. And this is how we obtain the in-between, where transcendental empiricism can take place. For as we have seen, it is transcendental empiricism that allows us to experience, and therefore to know in a certain way, the plane of immanence. But what is it that allows us to live a life? A life is a mode of existence. It's an act of selection that is similar to the eternal return as described in difference and repetition. It's a repetition out of which difference is produced. Difference defined as the set of all possible affections. But this difference is not a unity. It's not a unified concept. The indefinite article a in a life certainly means one, but it's not an original unity like the one or life without an article. That is, an absolute unity that conditions transcendence, an ultimate category. In fact, it's just the opposite. It's a singularity. As Deleuze says, the one is not the transcendent that might contain immanence, but the immanent contained within a transcendental field. One is always the index of a multiplicity, an event, a singularity, a life. With this semantic play, Deleuze is able to redefine the one not as something that opposes a multiplicity, but rather as the personal index of a multiplicity. Perhaps you can feel that with this text, Deleuze proposes a solution to an age-old problem, namely the problem of movement. You may recall Zeno's famous paradox of the arrow and the target. If I shoot an arrow at a target, the fact that I can divide at any point the remaining distance between arrow and target by 2 means that the arrow can never reach the target. Of course, Zeno knew full well that the arrow does in fact reach the target, and so what he meant was that while we can easily represent the fixed position of an object, we cannot represent movement itself. Similarly, we cannot think change, we can only represent it through fixed points. That's what we've seen before. What Zeno meant to show was that movement is therefore an illusion, something outside of being, something that cannot be represented. But Deleuze argues for the opposite, in the same way that the singularity that is a life defines a plane of immanence, which in turn defines a transcendental field, which grounds actual experience, or representation. Pure movement is the condition of representation, and representation is merely a special aspect of movement, its actual limit. This is more or less where Immanence Alive concludes, but there are a few points that remain unclear. Notably, how does the virtual limit itself? Or equivalently, how does the virtual become transcendent? And what is this lowest point of movement that we call actuality? Finally, we have seen how actualization operates, but how does the reverse process occur? In order to answer these questions, let us examine the notes published in the 1996 reedition of the Dialogues, and see if we can speculate about what ensembles and multiplicities would have looked like. The notes are very short and they are extremely dense, so for the sake of clarity I'll limit the discussion to the problems that we have just enumerated. The first question was this: how is the infinite limited in practice? At the heart of this question there is the idea that, as Deleuze says, purely actual objects do not exist. This seemingly paradoxical statement forms the foundation of Deleuze's ultimate metaphysical vision, and here's why. The relationship between the actual and the virtual is asymmetrical, mirroring the relationship between transcendence and immanence. While transcendence is not immanent, immanence encompasses or implies transcendence. In this framework, actual objects are in external relations to each other. And because they are all actual, that is, simultaneous, these external relations must be in space, in a pure present. But actual objects do not remain in their state, however. They change constantly, as we all know. This means that there must exist a second type of relations between objects, a relation that is not grounded in a pure present, but in which there is the possibility of succession. The relation of succession means that the pure present is now doubled by the past, and it is this past which we access in our memory that is going to be the basis of the virtual. To make a blunt sketch, we can say that when a memory becomes present and actual, it is the process called actualization, and when a present passes, we will say that it is virtualized. It's the process of virtualization. These two mechanisms are complementary, meaning that as soon as an object is actualized as an image, it mobilizes and produces a flock of virtual objects, or virtualities. For example, memories by which I can recognize the present image, by comparing it with something that I have in my memory. Here's what Deleuze says about the virtuals. These virtuals vary in kind as well as in their degree of proximity from the actual particles by which they are both emitted and absorbed. They are called virtual insofar as their emission and absorption, creation and destruction, occurs in a period of time shorter than the shortest continuous period imaginable. This quote reveals two crucial insights. First, virtuals are fundamentally temporal objects. And because immanence produces transcendence, this means that spatial relations are a special case of these temporal objects. In other words, space is a subset of time. Secondly, the fact that spatial relations occur in the present means that the present must be a special case of the past. But how is that possible, and what would that even mean? The quote just mentioned reveals the solution. The shortest period of time imaginable represents a cut in time. a separation between something that was present and is now past, but which also defines a new present. These cuts, as we have seen, are sensations, but now we can be a bit more precise. They are sensations in the sense that they're not just things that are felt physically, but they're also affections from virtual images that cut the flow of time and delimit a continuum, which is the lived present, while also adding to the past. These cuts in time manifest as fixed points of representation, as we have seen. For example, when I recognize an object thanks to my memory. By contrast, the time between two cuts is a space of affection. Deleuze describes it as follows. He says, "The virtual images delimit a continuum, whether one takes all of the circles together or each individually, a spatium defined in each case by the maximum of time imaginable." It's interesting to see how Deleuze contrasts the minimum amount of time imaginable with the maximum now. But why, and what does this mean? The answer is that as these cuts are effectuated, a subject is formed who is not only able to say I, and that regroups all these sensations and affections and images of the past that are needed around itself, but now it's also able to conceive a third dimension of time, namely the future. The future does not exist by definition, but it comprises a second sort of virtual objects, namely all the things that I can hypothesize or strategize about. And this time that I can now conceive, and about which I can say that it's eternal, or infinite perhaps, is completely empty. I can put in it whatever I want, all the anticipations and finalities that I can expect, but unfortunately also all the anxieties and fears that I may have. This challenge is too big for me, as Deleuze says in Difference and Repetition, mentioning this new mode of perception. This new vision, this new mode of perception, Deleuze calls it the crystal, not just in this text, but in most of his writings. The crystal is as pure an actuality as can be, so it answers our second question. The crystal occurs in the mutual affection between actual and virtual, or between the pure past and the pure present. As Deleuze says, this perpetual exchange between the virtual and the actual is what defines the crystal. To be very concrete, and following Bergson, we can understand the crystal as something that is fixated for a while in time, and in which I can look and see things, have ideas, or even see at a distance. But this third type of time is empty because it's neither completely here and now, filled with a sensation, nor is it a pure memory. Rather, it's something that is indiscernible between the two. This interplay between actual and virtual occurs on what Deleuze calls the plane of immanence. He states, the plane of immanence includes both the virtual and its actualization simultaneously, without there being any assignable limit between the two. Yet he also notes that the actual falls from the plane like a fruit, whilst the actualization relates it back to the plane. In this process, the actual emerges from the virtual, but through this process of actualization, it also feeds back into the virtual. This is the answer to our third question. You can see that between the actual and the virtual, there happens to be something that Deleuze calls a circuit. It's impossible to say which element in the circuit is the cause and which one is the effect. So as the root of the future, there is this indiscernibility. As Deleuze says, the two aspects of time, the actual image of the present which passes and the virtual image of the past which is preserved, are distinguishable during actualization, although they have unassignable limits, but exchanged during crystallization to the extent that they become indiscernible, each relating to the role of the other. The world of immanence is a world teeming with life, ever-changing and ever in movement. It is extremely complex and very deep. In fact, it's dangerous if you adopt it as a way of life. Rather than a vertical world which divides being from non-being, the world of immanence could perhaps be described in accordance with the Stoic description as a sphere, where the interior is virtual and inaccessible, but can be represented on its surface in the incorporeal changes, as if the linear succession between actual and virtual defined and surrounded this interior space. As for ensembles and multiplicities, we don't really have a definitive structure of the book, as I mentioned, and we can only speculate as to what it may look like. But if I had to guess, I might go for something like this. Let me know in the comments if you see another way in which this book could have been structured. Let me thank my fantastic patrons for their generous contributions. Thank you so much for your comments and support. This is what gets this channel going. And so I'd like to thank the viewer who kindly suggested that we study this text. That was a great idea. If you too would like to support this channel, please follow the links in the description to my Patreon or Ko-fi. For now, thank you all for watching, and see you soon.